Okay. Hi, Bob. Welcome to the Explorer Poet podcast.
Hi, good to be here.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for coming. I originally listened to you. I came across you on another podcast, and then I went and checked out your website. And on your website, I don't know how long it's been up. I don't know how long it's been since you checked it or updated it. But you've got this line at the top that says "Exploring the further reaches of internal family systems." And there's two things that jump out to me. This is the Explorer Poet podcast, and so I just love the idea of exploring, but also just this idea of internal family systems, what it is, why it's been helpful for so many people. And to be honest, it's something that's fairly new to me. I only know about it from a few conversations that I've listened to, such as conversations I've heard you have with other people, and then just a handful of small references in books and some conversations I've had myself. So really, in reaching out to you, I was hoping that we could really do a dive into IFS, internal family systems, and have you just walk me through maybe even just like a primer on what this is and how it's been useful for some people. But I also want to make sure that we talk about some of the things that you've produced as far as books. So I was aware of your book, The Others Within Us, Internal Family Systems, Porous Mind, and Spirit Possessions. But you actually have a book that just came out recently within a couple of days, When You're Going Through Hell, Keep Going. So I wanted, maybe that would be a good place to start so people can get an idea of who you are and kind of how you approach certain topics. And then, after that, maybe we could dive into IFS. So tell me a little bit about the book, the impetus for the book, and kind of what the final product came out to be.
Well, let me back you up a little bit. I think it would go better if I tell you what IFS is first.
Oh, sure. Yeah, no, that makes sense. Then let's jump into IFS. And I'm really curious about the underlying philosophy, but also a little bit about the history and the influences and development, and then what the practice looks like today.
It was created or invented, discovered really by a guy named Richard Schwartz. Everybody calls him Dick, about 40 years ago, maybe a little more now. And it's a therapeutic modality that primarily, but it's also used in a lot of other areas, including teaching, mediation, a whole bunch of stuff like that. And it's based on the idea that we're all multiple personalities. You are not one being. You are much more like a team. You're much more like a football or basketball team than a tennis player or a golfer. And our minds have to be structured that way, with relatively encapsulated modules or subpersonalities that are sparsely interlinked with other similar subpersonalities, parts, modules, whatever you want to call them. And actually a book I did a while ago with Dick Schwartz called Many Minds, One Self explains why this is so and talks about many of the other traditions and cultures that recognize this idea that we're really multiple. And this in and of itself is causes a revolution in psychotherapy if you take this idea seriously. And a lot of people know about multiple personality disorder and all of that. That's multiplicity as the product of trauma. In IFS, we believe, and I think we can prove, multiplicity is good, natural. It's the architecture of our mind. And there's lots of reasons why this is so. And so one of the things it changes is what is healing. From the metaphor I like, from an IFS point of view, most people are walking around in a state of internal civil warfare. They have part of you, oh, I hate this job, I want to quit it. Another part's going, I got to work, I need the money, what about the mortgage? And they're going like this all day long. Or I want that ice cream, I'm overweight. I mean, dozens. Yeah, the laugh of recognition, dozens of these. And much or most people's energy goes into internal fighting like this. So the IFS model, a description of IFS healing would be converting that internal civil war into something more like an orchestra or a choir or an improvisational jazz band that can fight. And this releases a great deal of human creativity and energy. There's another thing that Dick discovered is that what he calls self with a capital S. And there is some like witness function, some core of wisdom, knowledge, wholeness within everybody, even the most severely damaged people who are not supposed to have anything like that in them have it. And another way to look at healing in IFS is it's helping the person develop a relationship between the warring parts and that core real self of who they really are. So that's basically the idea of IFS. And when we do work, we help people go inside and meet all their parts or subpersonalities. Most of us have some idea of a wounded child, but there are lots more kinds of parts. There's protectors and other things. Now, the area I've focused in, the others within, if you start going into the mind farther and farther and get into the antipodes of the mind, there's things in there that are not part of our personal life. And this is where it gets very weird. This is why I say, exploring the farther reaches. And some of these, like legacy burdens, things that came down through our family to us, are now, there's hard science behind it, epigenetics, and we could go into some of the experiments. It seems to be the standard in America now is if you can do it with rats, it's real. If it's only humans, it doesn't count. We can do this stuff with rats now, so it's real. But even beyond legacy burdens, there are energies or forces or spirits, or in IFS, they're usually called unattached burdens or guides, that can get into us and have huge impact on our minds for good or bad. And Dick really did not like me talking and writing about this because he thought it was so weird. It would be used to discredit his model. But I thought it was really important for human healing, so I wouldn't shut up. And it's caused me a lot of grief, but I think now he's more okay with it. And IFS is, in the therapy world, it's unbelievably popular right now. All the therapists want training. There's a waiting list of something like 10,000 people for the level 1 trainings. So he worked very hard for 40 years to promote this model among therapists, and he's been very successful. I do believe it's the most potent and respectful mode of therapy available. But even saying that, I think it just cracks open a door and starts to let the light in. I think as a species and as a culture, we're so profoundly ignorant. We're nowhere near any kind of final answers. We're just cracking open doorways. So that would be the somewhat long answer to your question.
Yeah, there's a lot of really interesting things in there. Well, first of all, just thanks for just sharing the story, I guess, and the development of it. I can obviously see the hesitancy that Dick Schwartz might have had with you going out and trying to publicize some of these ideas. In a lot of ways, it sounds similar to the Jungian camp, where he had a lot of ideas that he was coming up with, and wanting to be a scientist, wanting to have empirical evidence. He didn't want to just go out there and start talking about ideas simply because he felt like he had experienced them. But it is fascinating to me to take this from a spiritual or more mythological direction. It's fascinating that at the end, or at some point in this process of the human meme focused on some monotheistic God or some level of like, we're all individuals and we're all, ourselves, to have this come full circle to ideas that are really more, I guess you would consider them primitive or archaic, this idea that there are all these different things inside of us And it's almost as if our Western culture tried very, very hard to get rid of that idea, only to then have a lot of really sick people who need therapy.
Yeah, definitely. There are quite a few thinkers who feel this way. There's, for example, Charles Taylor of McGill wrote quite a few books about how we came to have this view of what he called the buffered self. Like, we're separate. Everything inside our head is ours. It's private. It constitutes our identity. He says that idea only really got going about in the time of the Reformation, 400 or 500 years ago, maybe, and that it's poisonous. It's killing us. And Tanya Luhrmann, the great anthropologist from Stanford, talks about this as the Citadel Theory of Mind. And it looks like a fortress, this Western concept of who we are, impermeable, isolate, looks like a fortress, but it's actually incredibly fragile because it's so brittle. You hear one voice and you go, oh, my brain's broken. That's it. Goodbye. I'm on meds for the rest of my life. She talks about, and an idea I think is super important, is that mind is actually porous. Every living system is porous. Every living cell has a semi-permeable membrane around it. Why would our minds be different? And there's lots of other ways I think I can demonstrate that overwhelmingly.
Help me understand what you mean when you say that our mind is porous. Is this your way of saying that ideas can get in there or energies can get in there?
Ideas, energies, belief systems, maybe even spirits, if you want to use that metaphor. Richard Dawkins is one of the 4 atheists. He absolutely despises religion and spirituality. But he came up with this theory of memes and memeplexes. He says certain ideas or conglomerations of ideas can move from one mind to another, infect the new mind, replicate there, and then move out from them into other minds. That's a totally atheistic explanation of spirit possession.
Yeah.
You don't need to believe in spirits to realize this stuff's true, and it happens.
Yeah.
I think if we ignore it, it makes it much harder to help a whole bunch of people.
Yeah. The message has been very strong, though, this idea that we are this one thing and everything else is some kind of outside influence. And even when I was younger, the description of multiple personalities, the only time anybody said the phrase multiple personalities was when they were talking about somebody who was considered damaged, or you hear all these phrases, off, strange, broken,
traumatized, crippled.
Yeah. And but I would say that even before I ever came across IFS, I had this experience of interacting inside of myself as multiple people or energies or something. And the first, well, to be 100% honest, the first time that I started to experience this was when I first started experimenting with cannabis. And so it just put me in this mental place where I could just kind of sit there and observe. I could be this observer that you're talking about, or this, it's the self or the control center or whatever it is. Even folks who are very, I would say on the Eastern side of things, the Buddhists who want to get rid of the ego and who meditate, and that's the focus. They still have this observer, and they acknowledge that there's this observer. And I started to have these personal experiences about where I was in this interaction with multiple selves inside of myself. And the first couple of times I had it, I felt very uncomfortable because I was too aware that I was doing it, and I had never done it before. But then after a while of doing it, there was like a part of me that just treated it like a board meeting. And I just said, hey, okay, we're all here. We're all here. So
welcome.
Yes. Yeah. I even had the experience of like I said, I treated it like a board meeting. So I laid out an agenda, some things that we needed to discuss. And one of the most interesting parts of the whole experience was that I said, let's kick this off with some awards or thank yous, some recognition. And we kind of went around the room or the space in my mind and just said thank you to the parts of me that had done something significant, had achieved something. And then kind of following this path a little bit further, I would say I got to this point where I had an experience where it was the first time that I had included parts of myself that I had always tried to avoid. And so I had these like feelings in my stomach, this pit. I had these anxieties kind of in my body. And I remember there was one point where I turned to them and I said, what is it that you want to communicate? Like, what is it that you want me to understand? And it was in doing that I just felt this sudden relief, this sudden, like, it was just like, that's all that feeling wanted, was for me to go, oh, I'm aware that you're there and it's okay. What can I do for you?
Yeah, that's what it's like, I think. This is not a new idea. Plato had a multiple model of mind. In one of the dialogues, Socrates is talking to one of the other guys, and it was all guys. There were no women in these things. And they just mentioned, well, we can have arguments inside our minds, so that means obviously there are many different selves in here. And they just sort of went, oh, that's so obvious, it's not worth talking about. And we have buried that. It's hard for the arrogant Western mind to accept that fact. And, Daniel Siegel, who writes a lot about interpersonal neurobiology, and there are over 50 books published in that field now. He says, our language is so permeated with this idea of an impermeable self that we cannot talk honestly. We need to invent new words. And he's been trying to do that, and it's very awkward to try and use different language. There are lots of other philosophers who have very similar ideas. I actually think this idea of a citadel of mind, a citadel model of mind, underlies almost all of the most terrible things about the modern world. If you think about it, it is almost a definition of alienation. If you buy into this belief that you're this separate, defended thing, you're going to feel alienated. It's also going to be okay for you to trash other people and okay for you to trash the environment because you're separate. So it's a powerful idea in some ways, but really, really poisonous in others.
Yeah, it makes me think back to what you were saying about Richard Dawkins and his idea around memes, because the thing with Richard Dawkins that's very strange to me is how strongly he positions himself against religion, while at the same time being able to explain the process of religion. Because if you take this idea of memes, then it's if you think about biological evolution, then the same forces are working on a cultural level through the shaping of these memes. And so rather than having DNA as our genetics, we have these memes as the genetics of our culture. And so if it's an evolution, you look back far enough, again, going back to this idea that there's one God, that's like the beginning of this idea that there is only me as this individual, and that in some way I need to conquer it or dominate it. And so I could see I guess that's the irony of it, is you can see the evolution of this idea and how it got us to where we are. But it is an interesting take to then be able to explain the process of the memes, but then be so angry with the people who, I guess, fall victim to the memes.
Yeah, I was just listening to Bernardo Kastrup, who I think is truly, truly brilliant. And he says, the modern atheists are fundamentally, profoundly religious people. They believe in their atheism with a fervor. I think he's right. I want to say something else about this emergence of the idea of the ego and the emergence of the therapeutic attitude towards who we are. These things emerged at the same time as imperialism and colonialism emerged in the external world. And this is a point, I work a fair amount with indigenous people. This is a point they make, that most Western therapy is a colonialism of the mind. It's this ego manager function trying to colonize the whole unconscious. And it is as destructive and as poisonous a process as colonialism has been on the surface of the planet. And I don't think it's an accident that, they also call it imperialist. There is some imperialism and colonialism in the older attitudes of the therapy world.
Yeah, and it is interesting, this idea of the ego. Again, going back, I read a lot of Carl Jung because just the framework he puts forth for understanding the psyche, it seems to make a lot of sense. And then also this idea of his path to, say, healing, or what he would call individuation, is to take the individual and find a way to move that center of control, or that locus of control, away from the ego and to this idea of the self. In the Eastern tradition, it's this idea of just annihilating the ego entirely, or turning it off somehow. But in the West, where we are so ego driven, like we have colonized pretty much as we could colonize physically, and then also this mind space. It's this other solution similar to what you're describing through the IFS. Through IFS is just moving that locus of control away from perhaps an ego that was formed in childhood, and placing it more in the center to this, in a sense, it's just a more balanced part of ourselves who's I don't know, just able to communicate perhaps better and get some negotiation better within our own selves, between the parts of ourselves.
I think if you read Jung, you've probably come across Edward Edinger, and he talks a lot about the ego-self axis, and that this is where healing happens, and IFS would agree with this, in the relationship between that self and what we normally call the ego. I don't like, and Dick really doesn't like, people who are bad-mouthing the ego as though it was some demon that causes all this trouble. No, it's usually a group of parts who are trying to manage your life in a way that gets you fed and puts a roof over your head. They're not bad, they're not destructive, but they lack some kind of deeper connection to self or spirit or higher power, or whatever words you want to have for that ground of being.
Yeah, absolutely. And this chorus, or this group of, what do you in the IFS system, what do you call this group of people that is within ourselves?
Well, the parts, which would be very analogous to what Jung called the complexes.
Okay.
And there are different kinds of parts, basically two. There's protectors and then exiles. Exiles are those little wounded ones who are usually hiding away. Protectors would include the managers, which we would call ego. And there's also usually reactive protectors that we call firefighters, that would be more like, if it hurts too much in here, I'm going to go out and get drunk, and to hell with the rest of you. That would be a typical firefighter reaction. Okay,
so this idea, though, that none of them are necessarily bad.
Yeah, none of them are bad. They carry burdens. Even suicidal parts are not bad. They just carry big burdens. And we can help them get rid of their burdens and free them up, and then they can release all the wonderful energies they have. The exiles, for instance, a lot of people want to get rid of. This little hurt kid who's whining, curled up in the corner, and you think, oh, shut that kid up. No, when you get the burden of pain off that kid, it usually holds your innocence, your playfulness, your sense of delight, and a lot of other stuff that really can transform your life when you can welcome that back in and get all the dirt and muck off of it.
Yeah. Yeah. I think about it. I I grew up in a family where we didn't talk about our feelings. We didn't talk about our emotions. We obviously didn't work through them or discuss them. And so I grew up in a place where it felt strange to even feel them. It felt scary. It felt like, I needed to avoid that as much as possible. But now, having come to where I've come, I look at emotions very differently. I don't always know how to manage them effectively, but I think of them as messengers. And they're these messengers that are, they must deliver their message, or they're just going to kind of hang around on the property. And so you can either, when they're knocking, you can either let them in and have them share their message so that they will leave and they'll go away. Or if you ignore them, they're just going to sit around the property waiting for you to come out, waiting for a moment, knocking on the door every now and then in inopportune moments. And
they might turn into a physical illness and really get your attention.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And that's something that I see more and more clearly as I experience different people with different illnesses. But I can see also just how you connect that then to to what Jung would call the complexes, because initially I was thinking this was more, and it may be, but I was thinking that these parts were more similar to Jung's archetypes.
Well, the archetypes, as Jung went in, first thing he finds is complexes, things from the person's own personal lifetime. He keeps going in further. He starts meeting these archetypes. At first, they look sort of human. As he keeps going in further and further, he meets these archetypes, and they're no longer human. They're divine, they're incredible, they're weird. So I think we have the same similar process for IFS. We go in there, the first thing we meet are all these parts. They come from our own lifetime. They're basically kids who got hurt in one way or another. We go in further, we start meeting these legacy burdens, cultural, and then we go in there far enough, we start meeting stuff that does not fit any convenient Western category. And people tend to go, I ain't going there.
Do you interact with these parts in that order because of the way that the psyche is, where if you're going to approach the parts, if you're going to approach the unconscious, whatever it may be, are these the ones that are just going to come to us first because they're the messengers just waiting around out on the lawn?
Usually, not always. Sometimes people have stuff from the depths, the profoundest depths, come up and whack them in the head, and they have to pay attention to it. I think many of the people who are locked up as psychotic are actually having that kind of experience. And one of the big things that IFS has done, and well, there's also this grassroots movement called the Hearing Voices movement. You ever hear of them?
I haven't, no.
Oh, they're amazing. They're mostly all ex-psychiatric patients. And, many of them hear voices. And that used to be enough to get you locked up, hearing voices and talking to them. And the psychiatrists say, don't listen to those. That's crazy. And shut them up. And, have just a horrible, hostile, disrespectful attitude towards these voices. So it's not too surprising the voices were pissed off.
Yeah.
But the Hearing Voices people, these psychiatric patients got together and they started talking about, well, what's your voice like? And what does it say? And if you treat it this way, is it a little... IFS basically encourages people to have respectful conversations with all the voices in your head, to welcome them. Many of them are parts of you who just want your attention and some friendship. And when you greet them with respect and kindness, they often have huge gifts for you. Even voices like suicidal voices can have huge gifts.
What when it comes to suicidal voices, how do you think about that? This part of you that's like trying to say, I want to die, or we should die. What is that thought process?
If you think about these protectors, right, as a class, we said they're these managers who are trying to get you to do your life so that you have food and a home. There are also these things we call firefighters that are reactive. When the emotion and pain gets big, they do something. drink a 6-pack of beer, eat 2 pounds of chocolate, max out the credit card on stuff you don't need, cocaine, heroin, fentanyl. There's a pyramid. It gets bigger and bigger as the pain gets bigger and bigger, and these smaller ones aren't doing it anymore. At the top of almost everyone's pyramid is suicide. Some part is going, when it gets so bad in here that we absolutely cannot stand it anymore, I'll be the one to save this person. So it's sort of heroic in a way. It's a last-ditch line. And so it's not bad. It's not wrong. So we would negotiate with that and say stuff like, hey, if there was a way we could get this person out of all this pain without you having to kill the body, would you be open to that? And they almost always answer, yeah, I'd love that, but you can't. And then we just say, well, how about as an experiment giving us a little room so that we can prove to you we can? Now we're no longer fighting with the suicidal part. It's no longer an enemy we are trying to control and manipulate, and it's no longer something we disrespect and think is wrong and bad. We see it as a part who's in a desperate, desperate place and doing the last heroic thing to save the person from unbearable misery. And we sort of partner with it. Hey, we can help you get your goal met in a way that doesn't involve killing the body. That's a huge change. Huge. And we even tell this, or I even tell the suicidal part, if it gets down to it, I'm going to do absolutely everything I can to keep the body alive. And it's not because I don't respect you. I do respect you and what you're trying to do, but I'm going to, so really upfront and clear with it, not bullshitting it. A lot of these parts are really smart. They detect bullshit. Wow, they got good bullshit detectors. So it's real important to be, honest and upfront.
Yeah, just that example of talking to a part of ourselves that may be considering suicide or pushing for that. And then just the way that you responded by saying, I'm going to do everything I can to keep this person alive, even though, it doesn't mean I'm trying to disrespect you. It's a very interesting approach because, and I've had a number of conversations on this podcast about this idea of polarization. And those are two, like, you can't get more polarized than this part of you that wants to keep you alive and this part that wants to end you. To be able to talk about, to take two polar stances and be able to just simply say, I understand that you have a point. I understand that you're an entity and you have some form of rationality to get to this position, but I have a different rationality and I have a different motivation, and I'm going to approach it in a way where I'll compete against you in a way, but I won't do it in a cruel way. I won't do it in a disrespectful way. This just seems to me as like the type of example of healing that would take place in an individual. And if enough individuals could heal in that way, bringing these opposites or these polarizations together in a respectful, calm, mutually inclusive manner, like that's the type of healing that would actually heal the world.
Yeah. Stopping the Civil War and turning it into a jazz band.
Yeah.
Let me say something. What polarization is a big concept in IFS, and we have a slightly different view of it.
Okay. I'd love to hear it.
It is the underlying dynamic of all addictions. You got some part over here is going, you're a jackass. You got drunk again last night. We have to go to work. We have a terrible hangover. Fuck you. And you have this part over here going, I like to drink. And our life is so miserable, we deserve a few beers. And then wham, wham, wham. And if those were the only two parts in the system, it would be hopeless as it appears. But there's a lot more in the system. Number one, there's self, this observing ego. So what we try and do, working with a polarization like this, is stop them from interacting and get them to form a self-part relationship with each side. Oh, it makes sense you want them to be able to work. That's really necessary. can we talk to that part? Yeah, it makes sense. Things hurt so bad. You need to numb. Yeah, that makes sense too. And then, so you can form a new kind of relationship through self so that you're not on one side or the other of the polarization. And then you can usually ask them, you get permission from one to start with the other one. And then, hey, are you protecting someone down under you who's hurting real bad? And almost always the answer is yes. And if you're willing to let us go help that one you're protecting, and we could get it out of pain, would that help you? Yes. And then you negotiate with the protectors to do that. And then they don't have to stay in their own jobs anymore. They're freed up for something new. We don't try and get these protectors to shift right off. Much traditional addiction treatment was you partner with the manager, the one who says we got to go to work tomorrow, and you try and crush this part. Now that might work for a while, and with some milder cases that'll work, but there has to be a more fundamental transformation to really shift the dynamic of the addiction. And I think our whole society now is an addict.
Yeah, certainly in many ways, even ones that maybe just they're not as obvious to the collective. It's interesting when you talk about approaching these protectors and then finding that they're actually what they're protecting is another part of you. Is that pretty typical, or is the protector often also the one? Maybe it's a question that's not necessary, but it is. Do you find the parts are layered in that way, where there's this part is protecting this part?
Yep. Usually that would be the standard thing.
Interesting. So then the part that's beneath, it doesn't even have a voice in the situation until you're able to figure out who that part is.
Yeah. And we call those exiles.
Those are the exiles. Yeah.
And it's very respectful because there's lots of ways you can overpower the protectors and go down to the exiles right away. Hypnotherapy used to do this. EMDR can do this. Psychedelic medicine can do this. And it seems wonderful. Oh, there's this wounded kid. Let's go help it. Wham, we go there. But the protectors are going to feel disrespected, overpowered, and pushed aside. And when they come back on board, they're going to kick your ass. Understandably. I mean, I would too. So in IFS, we want to get permission from the protectors before we go down there. And then we come back to them when we've been able to help that exile. And then we say, hey, this is what we did. Did we do okay? Do you feel respected? And you could change now. You don't have to protect that one so much anymore. So in that way, ironic, I think IFS is the most potent and respectful mode of therapy we have today. And I think it is potent because it's respectful. We tend to think that respectful people aren't strong or something like that. I just think that's nuts. That's arrogant Hollywood stuff.
Yeah. Even when you think about it from an ego perspective, I often think about it as if you have a weak ego, then you're going to be a more guarded, defensive, more, you're going to put up more walls and create a bigger citadel. But that's because the ego is actually not as strong as it could be. And when an ego becomes stronger, it actually starts dropping some defenses. It can kind of relax, and it becomes, if when you think about dogs with dog psychology, I don't know if this ever crosses your mind, but what dogs are looking for is an environment that's just calm. They want like a calm dominance, like somebody who's in charge, who can take care of business, but is in the meantime, hey, we're all just getting along.
Yeah, that internal civil war thing again. And now the areas, all this causes a revolution in psychotherapy. I mean, if you take multiplicity as normal and natural, which I believe it is, and I think there's overwhelming evidence of that. A book I did a few years ago with Richard Schwartz that I co-authored, Many Minds, One Self, provides extensive and I think overwhelming evidence that this is the case. And, we could go through a bunch of that if necessary. But that in and of itself changes everything. Now, if you add to that this idea that we are porous, that our minds are surrounded by a semi-permeable membrane, then things really get different, really bizarre. And I think both of these, it's like when we discovered the Earth wasn't the center of the universe, it was like, oops, we're not so important anymore. Both of these are big steps down again. Hey, I'm not even the boss in my own mind. Oh, my own mind isn't really my own mind. It's connected to all these other beings. So it's hard for people.
Yeah, I could imagine it being difficult because at some level to heal, to be healthy, you have to accept that you have never fully been in charge. You have to accept these unconscious side of you or these parts of you. And then you have to be willing to approach them, which I do want to ask you about. The way that you talk about IFS as if it's a theory or a philosophy, but in practice, the process usually involves somebody who's guiding somebody else in this process of interacting with the parts. Is this something that people can approach on their own, or is it far more wise to have another person kind of guide you through this?
I believe there's an app you can get on your phone that you can do it with. There's a book by a guy named Jay Hurley called Self-Therapy, where you can work on yourself. You can just read Schwartz's book, Introduction to Internal Family Systems. There's tons of free stuff online. There's a lot on my website. A guy named Derek Schwartz, who recently died, produced many, many, many really good videos. And you could get a really good basic training in IFS just by watching his free YouTubes. And, for a lot of people, need help at some times in this process.
Yeah, I could see somebody who has the ability to go into this mind space where they're actually interacting with the parts. If they're able to conceptualize what's happening or just be, present with the experience and then come out of it with some feeling of integration or some feeling of, oh, that actually was helpful. I mean, I would say that that's what I've done in my own experience. And I have had moments where I get a little panicked, it's like a little bit too intense. But at the same time, if you can come out of that, you just feel so much more whole or like you've worked something out internally. But if you're not able to do that, if you can't integrate it, it seems like those are the people you were talking about who would be in a psychiatric ward, who for some reason they heard this voice or they interacted with this part of themselves and they just aren't able to integrate it. Is that a risk? Is that something that people should?
Not much, really. I don't think.
You don't think so?
I think this can be done without as much professional supervision as the professionals think you need.
Well, I tend to agree about most things. I'm a little bit of a like a do it myself, or I would rather almost always ask for forgiveness than permission.
Yep.
And so I'm that kind of person as well. I'm just curious if that's something if that's a warning that you would give, or it sounds like you're actually doing the opposite, where you would just encourage people to go figure out as much as they want to figure out.
Yeah, it depends on how functional or how disturbed someone is. I mean, if someone's attempted suicide half a dozen times, I'd say get some help. Don't try and do this on your own. I get help to work with my own parts and the other things, and I think for people who are working as therapists or healers, it's super important to get help. So you clean up your own house. You can't take people where you haven't gone.
Yeah. That's something I strongly believe in, and that I've experienced a little bit for myself when I've had that experience of going to somebody who's a professional and trying to kind of get them to go where I'm trying to go, and it's obvious that they don't want to go there because they haven't worked it out for themselves.
It's scary. This whole idea of parts and subpersonalities is really scary for a lot of people, therapists included. And I think another thing that's super important is that we treat these parts as full spectrum personalities. They're not things. It's not like there's anger inside of me. No, there's this part who holds anger for you. And the part who holds anger has all the characteristics, let's say a 12-year-old boy. And it's also scared of girls, and it likes playing baseball. It's got the whole spectrum. And it really, really is important to deal with them as persons, as people. Did you know that this idea of personalism was behind Martin Luther King and the whole civil rights movement?
Personalism?
Well, it's the idea that what the really important thing is the personhood, the idea of people being individuals and people. And I actually think, everybody talks about consciousness as the hard problem. I think that's the semi-hard problem or the flaccid problem. The really hard problem is personhood. How do we form these personalities that are separate, and how's that all hang together? And anyway, Martin Luther King studied this at Boston University, which was the academic center of personalism in his day. And he based all of his civil rights movement on it. And he came up with a really good word I like a lot. He said, we have to treat everybody with a fundamental respect because they have somebodyness. I love that word. And, that's why you have everybody, the janitor, everybody, they're a person. They have this center. It's almost a spark of divine within them. And that concept led him to the idea of nonviolence and the whole. So, and it's an ancient, this goes back to the classical philosophers, so it's not new. There's a great quote. There's one writer was saying, all of my great ideas were stolen by the ancients.
Yeah, I could relate. Yeah, because you see the same ideas just come up over and over and over. Just kind of as an aside, actually, there's this movie that I've spoken about on this podcast a number of times, and I usually don't recommend Disney movies, but there's this Disney movie. It's a cartoon that I want to say came out in 2020, 2021. It's called Raya and the Last Dragon. And if someone like you was to watch it with thinking about IFS, essentially what it is this land where there's a dragon, the land is shaped like a dragon, and then it's split into all these kingdoms, which are the different parts of the dragon. And the challenge is it's almost as if the magic has disappeared and the real dragons are gone, and the water's drying up, and the different parts of the kingdom are fighting against each other. And the whole purpose of the movie is that Raya has to unite the kingdoms, and she does that by going to each kingdom and finding some character there who represents the problem that part of the kingdom is having with the rest of the kingdom. To me, it's like this beautiful metaphor or analogy of exactly what you're describing, as each of us as these multiple parts, and they all want to feel important, just like we want to feel in society. They all want to feel important. They want to feel like they're contributing in a way that's unique to them, that this is why I was put here on this earth, is to bring this thing to this group. And it's just interesting to me to see something like you're saying, IFS being one of the most popular forms, or kind of becoming one of the more popular forms of therapy. But then also you see these similar ideas popping up in art and media. And I think it's a combination of that meme complex that Richard Dawkins is talking about, where this whole thing, this human entity, is trying to figure it out. And this is one of the paths it's taking.
If you're thinking about that, a lot of people early on thought what we should do with all these parts is sort of mush them together and put them in a blender, and then you get one unified person. That does not work. And they resent being put in a blender. And if you think about a jazz band or something, it would be a lousy band if it was all drummers. You need all the different instruments with all their different skill sets, and you need that inside of you with all your different parts.
Yeah, it's such a human idea. It's so human that there would be one thing, there would be one person who would be able to help the whole group in this way, and that each one of us would have some unique ability in that way. It's just such a, from an evolutionary adaptation perspective, it's just so human to think about ourselves as that way, but also to think about the parts of ourselves that way. It just goes as you know, as within, so outside, and all of that.
Yeah, and this is revolutionary enough. We could talk a lot about other things. It completely turns on its head in psychotherapy world. But you add to this the idea that we are permeable, that stuff comes into us and goes out of us, and that this also is healthy and good. Pretty much every other society on the planet has recognized this basic biopsychological dynamic. And it can have, and every era of history, we find records of it, it can have huge impacts on human well-being for good or ill. And the metaphor most often used to describe it is spirit possession. Whatever the metaphor is, it's worth studying. It's important. It's significant. It happens. It's happened everywhere there have been people. And it's just our arrogant blindness that makes us not look. And I think we should be looking.
Yeah, aside from just somebody having a simple, you know, when you talk about spiritual possession, I would almost wonder if you would also throw in the more modern form of like UAP or UFO abduction type phenomena.
I definitely throw in their artistic inspiration.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in the Red Book, where he got all of his ideas, he was talking to beings who were not him and who were part human, part bird, and all these other amazing things. And he said later in his life, this is where all my ideas came out of, were these contacts with these beings. Who knows what they are?
Yeah. It seems like no matter how far we push in the realm of technology and science and empirical data, there's always going to be this other side that is completely, it just feels like a mystery to us. And it's almost as if we are going to just simply experience it. This is we've come a long way. So I appreciate you giving me that primer on IFS, but I do want to come back to your most recent book that came out just recently. And now that maybe that we've covered some of the more important topics, maybe you could dive in, just explaining the book a little bit. When You're Going Through Hell, Keep Going. It's
a book of quotations and short stories that I've harvested over 50 years of doing this kind of work. And they basically all relate to the theme of connecting this idea of therapy and healing to the idea of spirit and spirituality and spirit connection in those deeper, more mysterious worlds. And I find that a lot of times a short quote can sort of encapsulate a whole bunch of thinking in a way that makes it easy for me to use it in real time. So that's why I started collecting these things, and then people seemed to like them, so I thought I'd put them together and publish them. And just an example is a quote from the Sadhguru: "There is only one doorway to knowing, only one portal to knowing, and that is, I do not know." And all these people, and I spent much of my life trying to know. And you hear that quote and you're going, what the hell was I trying to do? I was trying to slam the door on new knowledge.
Yeah.
And, so just a simple little quote like that can, and when I find myself being arrogant during the day and, acting like a know-it-all, that quote will come into my mind and I'll get a little smile and I'll just go, okay. So that's the way they've helped me make this bridge between spirituality and psychotherapeutic healing. And hopefully they'll do that for other people too.
Yeah, I think that that bridge is really important, spirituality to psychotherapeutic healing, because there's a big push right now to treat everything as if it's a biological problem.
Crap. Absolute crap.
Exactly, yeah. It really just, I think that's what I was getting at when I was talking about science versus this idea that or this feeling that there is a greater mystery. And as long as we ignore that mystery and treat everything as if it's part of the body, then we're always going to have these parts of us that are you would feel like they're a nuisance, that they're troubling, dangerous. Yeah, the exiles.
Their experience is denied and invalidated and made wrong and bad. And we shut them up.
That's the end of this approach to treating everything as if it's biological, is that it comes down to a pill and a chemical process in your body and your brain. But you also, on your website at least, you talk a good amount about shamanism. And is this spirituality or approaching psychotherapy or therapeutic processes as a spirituality, is that the connection for you to this shamanism? I mean, because I'm also very much into shamanism, and I see this all this wisdom that for some reason we've left behind. But is that the connection for you? And then,
it's one of the modalities. Yeah. And I think, the great foundational textbook on shamanism is Mircea Eliade's Archaic Techniques of Ecstasy. Shamanism, Archaic Techniques of Ecstasy. And what I think it is we learn how to cultivate our inner senses, how to navigate in the inner world, the imaginal realm, the realm of images and autonomous ideas. Might also be the realm of spirits. I mean, if you like that language. And shamans know a great deal about this, a whole hell of a lot about this. So we should learn from them.
Yeah, I agree. This idea, it doesn't really matter which language you want to use, but this ability to go inside, to go deep down into the unconscious, or even at some level, the way you talk about porousness and these parts of you that they seem beyond you, or something, this idea that the shaman can go so deep down in there that they find things that aren't even part of themselves. The ability to learn how to navigate that and come all the way back to just interacting in the real world. It seems like a very valuable, important part of humanity, and it always has been, but it's something that's restricted or feared or not tolerated.
Yeah. And I think they bring back incredible riches from there. That's where all our visionaries and prophets come from. We need our visionaries and prophets, and today we silence them, drug them, shut them up, call them insane. And that's not everybody who's, locked up in a mental institution is a visionary, but many of them are. And we need those visions because we're obviously not running in a great direction. We need new sight. I think, there's sort of this outer world that science is exploring, and that's still a total mystery. I mean, the Big Bang doesn't explain anything. It just replaces one mystery with a bigger one. But I think we're much more ignorant in the inner world, the world of subjectivity. And we can learn about inner sense cultivation. There's something they talk about in therapy now called interoception, the ability to be aware of your subjective experience, your somatic experience. And there are now correlations. If you have poor interoception skills, you're much more likely to have major treatment-resistant depression. A lot of other nasty stuff happens when you cannot be aware of your inner world. There's nothing in our educational system which helps kids learn how to be aware of their inner world. Matter of fact, we squash it out of them. And there's really hard evidence now that this is incredibly valuable, important kind of skills to have.
Yeah, I agree. So I guess as much as Dick Schwartz didn't want you to publicize too much some of these ideas, but I think that the way I think about it is that if there's ideas that are helpful, it doesn't matter how esoteric they may come across. It's important to get them out there because gradually, that's how that's how gradually over time, new ideas, new concepts, new practices get integrated into the whole being of, you know.
And if people read my book or listen to my stuff and they think there's something that's just so weird and goofy, that's probably me. Give Dick the credit for the sort of mainline acceptable stuff. I'll be the weirdo. That's fine. I'm old. I don't need a career. I'll be the designated weirdo.
Yeah, that's really helpful. So we appreciate you taking on that role. What about this? Just a random question at the very end here. You have a few things on your website related to Korea, and I'm just curious. Part of it is shamanism, but I'm just curious what your connection to Korea is, because I also have a connection.
My wife is Korean.
Ah, okay, yeah.
I've had a previous partner who was Korean. I've had I don't know. There's some kind of connection I have to that country.
Okay.
Korean shamanism is fascinating, profound, 4,000 or 5,000 years old, and very different than what we normally think of as shamanism. But that would be a whole nother hour, at least.
Well, it does sound interesting and it sounds fun, but I appreciate you taking this hour to walk me through IFS, your experience with it. I haven't had a lot of direct. This is probably the most direct access I've had to the idea of IFS and just sitting down and talking with someone. But I'm definitely going to take a look at some of the material on your website, and I'll probably end up with your book as well, because it's something that seems so intuitive once you experience it, and then it just feels so natural. It's nice that somebody has come along, Dick Schwartz and yourself have come along and just tried to put it into and others who have made it more accessible to people. So I really appreciate that.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, if people are curious about finding out where they can purchase any of the books that you've written, or any of the material you have online, or if they're interested in working with you, where can they find you?
robertfalconer.us.
Okay, robertfalconer.us.
The books are on Amazon.
Okay, awesome. Well, Robert, Bob, I really appreciate you taking the time. This has been a lot of fun, and it's also been really informative. So again, thank you so much.
Great. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.